Welcome to the Thought Echo channel. I'm so glad you're joining me for story time today. Whether you're here to relax, learn, or just immerse yourself in a wonderful tale, you're in for a treat. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can join me for more stories and inspiration. Let's begin.
Step into a world where imagination knows no bounds, a world of red sands, twin moons, and ancient civilizations. A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs isn't just a story. It's an epic journey to the mysterious planet of Mars, or as its inhabitants call it, Barsoom. Follow the incredible tale of John Carter, a soldier of Earth who finds himself mysteriously transported to this alien world. There, amidst towering cities and endless deserts, he encounters strange creatures, fierce warriors, and the beautiful yet brave Deja-Thoris, a princess unlike any other. This timeless classic blends adventure, romance, and science fiction in a way that has captivated readers for over a century. As you listen, prepare to lose yourself in a Martian world where bravery, honor, and love collide against a backdrop of interplanetary war and discovery. So sit back, close your eyes, and let the story of a princess of Mars carry you to a place far beyond our world. A place where heroes are made and legends are born. Let's begin. Chapter 13, Love Making on Mars. Following the battle with the airship, the community remained within the city for several days, abandoning the homeward march until they could feel reasonably assured that the ships would not return. To be caught on the open plains with a cavalcade of chariots and children was far from the desire of even so warlike a people as the Green Martians. During our period of inactivity, Tars Tarkas had instructed me in many of the customs and arts of war familiar to the Tharks, including lessons on riding and guiding the great beasts which bore the warriors. These creatures, known as thoats, are as dangerous and vicious as their masters, but, once subdued, are sufficiently tractable for the purposes of the Green Martians. 2 of these animals had fallen to me from the warriors whose metal I wore, and in a short time, I could handle them quite as well as the native warriors. The method was not at all complicated. If the thoats did not respond with sufficient celerity to the telepathic instructions of their riders, they were dealt a terrific blow between the ears with the butt of a pistol. If they showed resistance, this treatment was continued until the brutes either were subdued or had unseated their riders. In the latter case, it became a life and death struggle between the man and the beast. If the rider were quick enough with his pistol, he might live to ride again, though upon some other beast. If not, his torn and mangled body was gathered up by his women and burned in accordance with Tharkian custom. My experience with Woola determined me to attempt the experiment of kindness in my treatment of my thoats. First, I taught them that they could not unseat me, even rapping them sharply between the ears to impress upon them my authority and mastery. Then, by degrees, I won their confidence in much the same manner I had adopted countless times with my many mundane mounts. I was ever a good hand with animals, and by inclination, as well as because it brought more lasting and satisfactory results, I was always kind and humane in my dealings with the lower orders. I could take a human life, if necessary, with far less compunction than that of a poor, unreasoning, irresponsible brute. In the course of a few days, my thoats became the wonder of the entire community. They would follow me like dogs, rubbing their great snouts against my body in awkward evidence of affection, and responding to my every command with an alacrity and docility that caused the Martian warriors to ascribe to me the possession of some earthly power unknown on Mars. "How have you bewitched them?" asked Tars Tarkas one afternoon, when he saw me reach my arm far between the great jaws of one of my thoats, which had wedged a piece of stone between 2 of its teeth while feeding upon the moss-lake, Vegetation in our courtyard. My kindness, I replied. You see, Tars Tarkas, the softer sentiments have their value, even to a warrior, in the height of battle, as well as upon the march. I know that my thoughts will obey my every command, and therefore my fighting efficiency is enhanced. I am a better warrior because I am a kind master. Your other warriors would find it to their advantage, as well as that of the community, to adopt my methods in this respect. Only a few days ago, you yourself told me that these great brutes, by the uncertainty of their tempers, often turned victory into defeat, since, at crucial moments, they might unseat and rend their riders. Show me how you accomplish these results, was Tars Tarka's only rejoinder, and so I explained as carefully as I could the entire method of training I had adopted with my beasts. Later, he had me repeat it before Lorqua's Tommel and the assembled warriors. That moment marked the beginning of a new existence for the Porthos. Before I left the community of Lorqua's Tommel, I had the satisfaction of observing a regiment of as tractable and docile mounts as one might care to see. The effect on the precision and celerity of the military movements was so remarkable that Lorqua's Tommel presented me with a massive anklet of gold from his own leg as a sign of his appreciation for my service to the horde. On the seventh day following the battle with the airship, we resumed the march toward Thark, as Lorqua's Tommel deemed another attack improbable. During the days preceding our departure, I had seen little of Dejathoris, as I had been kept very busy by Tars Tarkas with lessons in the art of Martian warfare and the training of my thoughts. The few times I visited her quarters, she was absent, either walking on the streets with Sola or investigating the buildings near the plaza. I warned them against venturing far from the plaza for fear of the great white apes, whose ferocity I knew all too well. However, since Wola accompanied them on all their excursions, and Sola was well armed, there was relatively little cause for concern. On the evening before our departure, I saw them approaching along one of the great avenues leading into the plaza from the east. I advanced to meet them, and, telling Sola that I would take responsibility for Dejathoris' safekeeping, I directed her to return to her quarters on some trivial errand. I liked and trusted Sola, but for some reason, I desired to be alone with Dejathoris, who represented to me all that I had left behind on Earth in agreeable and congenial companionship. There seemed to be bonds of mutual interest between us as powerful as if we had been born under the same roof, rather than on different planets, hurtling through space some 48 million miles apart. That she shared my sentiments, I was positive. On my approach, the look of pitiful hopelessness left her sweet countenance, replaced by a smile of joyful welcome. She placed her small right hand upon my left shoulder in a true red Martian salute. Sarkoia told Sola that you had become a true Thark, she said, and that I would now see no more of you than of any of the other warriors. Sarkoia is a liar of the first magnitude, I replied, notwithstanding the proud claim of the Tharks to absolute verity. Dejathoris laughed. I knew that even though you became a member of the community, you would not cease to be my friend. A warrior may change his mettle, but not his heart, as the saying goes on Barsoom. I think they have been trying to keep us apart, she continued. Whenever you have been off duty, one of the older women of Tars Tarka's retinue has always trumped up some excuse to get Sola and me out of sight. They've had me down in the pits beneath the buildings, helping them mix their awful radium powder and make their terrible projectiles. You know these have to be manufactured by artificial light, as exposure to sunlight always results in an explosion. Have you noticed that their bullets explode when they strike an object? The opaque outer coating is broken by the impact, exposing a glass cylinder, almost solid, in the forward end of which is a minute particle of radium powder. The moment the sunlight, even though diffused, strikes this powder, it explodes with a violence that nothing can withstand. If you ever witness a night battle, you will note the absence of these explosions. But the morning following the battle will be filled at sunrise with the sharp detonations of exploding missiles fired the preceding night. As a rule, however, non-exploding projectiles are used at night. While I was deeply interested in Dejathorus' explanation of this remarkable adjunct to Martian warfare, I was more concerned with the immediate problem of her treatment. That they were keeping her away from me was not a matter of surprise, but that they should subject her to dangerous and arduous labor filled me with rage. Have they ever subjected you to cruelty and indignity, Dejathorus? I asked, feeling the hot blood of my fighting ancestors leap in my veins as I awaited her reply. Only in small ways, John Carter, she answered. Nothing that can harm me, except my pride. They know I am the daughter of 10,000 Jedeks, that I traced my ancestry unbroken back to the builder of the first great waterway. And they, who do not even know their own mothers, are jealous of me. At heart, they despise their wretched fates and wreak their petty spite on me, who stands for everything they lack and all they most crave, but can never attain. Let us pity them, my chieftain. Even though we may die at their hands, we can afford them pity because we are greater than they, and they know it. Had I understood the significance of the words my chieftain as applied by a red Martian woman to a man, I would have been astounded. But at that time, I did not know, nor would I for many months thereafter. I still had much to learn on Barsoom. I presume it is the better part of wisdom that we bow to our fate with as good grace as possible, Dejathorus, but I hope, nevertheless, to be present the next time any Martian, green, red, pink, or violet dares to so much as frown at you, my princess. Dejathorus caught her breath at my last words, gazing upon me with wide eyes and quickened breath. Then, with an odd little laugh that brought roguish dimples to the corners of her mouth, she shook her head and exclaimed, "What a child! A great warrior, yet a stumbling little child. What have I done now?" I asked, perplexed. "Someday you shall know John Carter, if you live," she replied, "but I may not tell you. And I, the daughter of Mors Kayak, son of Tardos Mors, have listened without anger," she soliloquized in conclusion. Then she broke into one of her bright, happy moods, laughing and joking with me about my prowess as a Thark warrior contrasted with my soft heart and natural kindliness. "I presume that if you accidentally wounded an enemy, you would take him home and nurse him back to health," she teased. "That is precisely what we do on Earth," I replied. "At least, among civilized men." This made her laugh again. She could not understand it. Despite her tenderness and womanly sweetness, she was still a Martian. And to a Martian, the only good enemy is a dead enemy. Every dead foe means more to divide among the living. I was curious to know what I had said or done to cause her earlier perturbation. I continued to press her to enlighten me. "No," she exclaimed. "It is enough that you have said it, and that I have listened. And when you learn, John Carter, and if I be dead, as I likely shall be before the further moon has circled Barsoom another 12 times, remember that I listened, and that I smiled." It was all Greek to me, but the more I begged her to explain, the more resolute her denials became. So I eventually gave up in hopelessness. Night had now fallen, and as we wandered along the great avenue, lit by the 2 moons of Barsoom, with Earth gazing down upon us from her luminous green eye, it seemed that we were alone in the universe, and I, at least, was content that it should be so. The chill of the Martian night was upon us, and, removing my silks, I draped them across the shoulders of Dejathorus. As my arm rested for an instant upon her, I felt a thrill course through every fiber of my being, unlike anything I had ever experienced with any other mortal. It seemed to me that she leaned slightly toward me, but of that I could not be certain. Only this I knew. As my arm lingered there across her shoulders, longer than the simple act of adjusting the silk required, she did not draw away, nor did she speak. And so, in silence, we walked together across the surface of a dying world. But within the breast of at least one of us, something was born, that which is as old as time, yet always new. I loved Dejathoris. The touch of my arm upon her bare shoulder had spoken to me in words I could not misinterpret. I knew then that I had loved her since the very first moment my eyes met hers in the plaza of the dead city of Korid. Chapter 14. A Duel to the Death. My first impulse was to tell her of my love, but then I thought of the helplessness of her position. Only I could lighten the burdens of her captivity and protect her in my poor way against the thousands of hereditary enemies she would face upon our arrival at Thark. I could not risk causing her additional pain or sorrow by declaring a love that she, in all probability, did not return. Should I be so indiscreet, her position would become even more unbearable. The thought that she might feel I was taking advantage of her helplessness to influence her decision was the final argument that sealed my lips. "Why are you so quiet, Dejathoris?" I asked. "Perhaps you would prefer to return to Sola and your quarters?" "No," she murmured. "I am happy here. I do not know why, but I always feel happy and contented when you, John Carter, a stranger, are with me. At such times, it seems I am safe, and I feel that with you, I shall soon return to my father's court, where I will feel his strong arms around me and my mother's tears and kisses on my cheek." "Do people kiss, then, upon Barsoom?" I asked after she explained the word she used, as it was unfamiliar to me. "Parents, brothers, and sisters, yes," she replied, and then added in a low, thoughtful tone, "and lovers." "And you, Dejathoris, have parents, brothers, and sisters?" I asked. "Yes, and I." "Lover?" She fell silent, and I could not bring myself to repeat the question. "The men of Barsoom," she finally said, "do not ask personal questions of women, except their mothers and the women they have fought for and won." "But I have fought," I began, then immediately regretted my words. She turned quickly, cutting me off, and drew my silks from her shoulders. Holding them out to me, she walked away with the carriage of the queen she was, her head held high, toward the plaza and the doorway of her quarters. I did not attempt to follow her, other than to ensure she reached the building safely. Directing Woola to accompany her, I turned away, disconsolate, and entered my own quarters. I sat for hours, cross-legged and cross-tempered, upon my silks, brooding on the peculiar tricks chance plays upon us poor devils of mortals. So, this was love. I had evaded it for all the years. I had roamed the 5 continents and their encircling seas, despite beautiful women and tempting opportunities, despite a half desire for love and a constant search for my ideal. It had remained for me to fall hopelessly and furiously in love with a creature from another world. She was of a species similar, perhaps, but not identical to mine. A woman hatched from an egg, whose lifespan might span 1,000 years, whose customs and ideas were alien. A woman whose hopes, pleasures, and standards of virtue and right and wrong might differ as greatly from mine as those of the green Martians. Yes, I was a fool, but I was in love, though I was suffering the greatest misery I had ever known. I would not have had it otherwise for all the riches of Barsoom. Such is love, and such are lovers wherever love is known. To me, Dejathoris was all that was perfect, all that was virtuous, beautiful, noble, and good. I believed that with all my heart, from the depths of my soul. On that night in Korid, as I sat cross-legged upon my silks, the nearer moon of Barsoom raced through the western sky toward the horizon, lighting the gold, marble, and jeweled mosaics of my ancient chamber. I believe it now, even as I sit at my desk in the little study overlooking the Hudson. 20 years have passed. For 10 of them, I lived and fought for Dejathoris and her people. And for 10 I have lived on her memory. The morning of our departure for Thark dawned clear and hot, as do all Martian mornings, except during the 6 weeks when the snow melts at the poles. I sought out Dejathoris in the throng of departing chariots, but she turned her shoulder to me, and I could see the red blood rise to her cheek. With the foolish inconsistency of love, I held my peace when I might have pleaded ignorance of the nature of my offense, or at least its gravity, and thus, at worst, effected a partial reconciliation. My duty dictated that I ensure her comfort, so I glanced into her chariot and adjusted her silks and furs. In doing so, I was horrified to discover that she was heavily chained by one ankle to the side of the vehicle. "What does this mean?" I cried, turning to Sola. "Sarkoia thought it best," she replied, her face betraying her disapproval of the measure. Examining the manacles, I saw they were fastened with a massive spring lock. "Where is the key, Sola?" "Let me have it." "Sarkoia wears it, John Carter," she answered, without another word. I turned and sought out Tarkas, to whom I vehemently objected to the unnecessary humiliations and cruelties, though they seemed far greater to my lover's eyes, being heaped upon Dejathoris. "John Carter," he said, "if ever you and Dejathoris escape the Tharks, it will be upon this journey. We know you will not leave without her. You have shown yourself to be a mighty fighter, and we do not wish to manacle you. So we hold you both in the easiest way that ensures security. I have spoken." I recognized the strength of his reasoning immediately, and knew it would be futile to appeal his decision. However, I asked that the key be taken from Sarkoia, and that she be instructed to leave the prisoner alone in the future. "This much, Tarkas, you may do for me in return for the friendship that, I must confess, I feel for you." "Friendship?" he replied. "There is no such thing, John Carter. But have your will. I shall direct that Sarkoia cease to annoy the girl, and I will personally take custody of the key. Unless you wish me to assume the responsibility," I said, smiling. He looked at me long and earnestly before he spoke. "Were you to give me your word that neither you nor Dejathoris would attempt to escape until we have safely reached the court of Tall Hages, you might have the key and throw the chains into the river Is." "It would be better that you held the key, Tarkas," I replied. He smiled and said no more. But that night, as we were making camp, I saw him unfasten Dejathoris' fetters himself. Despite his cruel ferocity and coldness, there was an undercurrent of something in Tarkas that he seemed to battle constantly to suppress. Could it be a vestige of some human instinct, returning from an ancient ancestor to haunt him with the horror of his people's ways? As I approached Dejathoris' chariot, I passed Sarkoia. The black, venomous look she gave me was the sweetest balm I had felt in many hours. Lord, how she hated me! Her hatred bristled so palpably that one might almost have cut it with a sword. A few moments later, I saw her deep in conversation with a warrior named Zad, a hulking, powerful brute who had never made a kill among his chieftains. As such, he was still an Omad, or a man with only one name. On Barsoom, a warrior could win a second name only by taking the medal of a chieftain he had slain. It was this custom that entitled me to the names of either of the chieftains I had killed. Indeed, some warriors addressed me as Doder Sojat, a combination of the surnames of the two chieftains whose medal I had taken in fair combat. As Sarkoia spoke with Zad, he cast occasional glances in my direction, while she seemed to urge him strongly to some action. I paid little attention to it at the time, but the next day I had good reason to recall the circumstances and gain a deeper insight into the depths of Sarkoja's hatred and the lengths she was willing to go to exact her vengeance on me. Dejathoris would have none of me that evening. Though I spoke her name, she neither replied nor acknowledged my presence with so much as the flutter of an eyelid. In my frustration, I did what most lovers would have done. I sought information through an intermediary. In this case, it was Sola, whom I intercepted in another part of the camp. "What is the matter with Dejathoris?" I blurted out. "Why will she not speak to me?" Sola looked puzzled, as though such strange actions from two humans were entirely beyond her understanding, which, in truth, they were. "She says you have angered her, and that is all she will say," Sola replied. "She added that she is the daughter of a Jed, the granddaughter of a Jedek, and that she has been humiliated by a creature who is not fit to polish the teeth of her grandmother's Sarek." I pondered this report for some time before finally asking, "What is a Sarek, Sola?" "A small animal about the size of my hand, which red Martian women keep as pets," Sola explained. "Not even fit to polish the teeth of her grandmother's cat." I must have ranked quite low in Dejathoris' estimation, I thought. Yet I could not help but laugh at this strange figure of speech, so homely, and, in this respect, so earthly. It made me homesick, for it sounded very much like "not fit to polish her shoes." The phrase triggered a train of thought new to me. I began to wonder what my people on Earth were doing. I had not seen them in years. There was a family of Carters in Virginia who claimed close kinship with me. Supposedly, I was their great-uncle, or something equally absurd. I could easily pass for 25 or 30 years of age, and the notion of being anyone's great-uncle always seemed laughably incongruous. My thoughts and feelings were those of a boy. Still, I remembered the two little children in the Carter family who had adored their Uncle Jack, and whom I had loved in return. Standing there under the moonlit skies of Barsoom, I could see them as clearly as if they were before me. I longed for them as I had never longed for any mortals before. By nature a wanderer, I had never truly known the meaning of the word home. Yet, the great hall of the Carters had always stood for all that home meant to me. Now, my heart turned toward it, away from the cold and unfriendly peoples among whom I had been cast. Even Dejathoris despised me. I was a creature so low that I was not fit to polish the teeth of her grandmother's cat. Then, my sense of humor came to my rescue. Laughing, I turned to my silks and furs, and slept upon the moonlit ground the restful sleep of a tired, healthy fighting man. We broke camp early the next day and marched with only a single halt until just before dark. Two incidents broke the monotony of the march. Around noon, we spotted, far to the right, what appeared to be an incubator. Lorquist Tommel directed Tars Tarkas to investigate. Taking a dozen warriors, including myself, we raced across the velvety carpet of moss to the small enclosure. It was indeed an incubator, but the eggs were much smaller than those I had seen hatching in hours at the time of my arrival on Mars. Tars Tarkas dismounted and examined the enclosure closely, finally announcing that it belonged to the Green Men of Warhoon and that the cement was scarcely dry where it had been walled up. "They cannot be a day's march ahead of us," Tars Tarkas exclaimed, the light of battle leaping to his fierce face. The work at the incubator was brief. The warriors tore open the entrance, and two of them crawled inside, quickly demolishing all the eggs with their short swords. Then, remounting, we dashed back to join the cavalcade. During the ride, I took the opportunity to ask Tars Tarkas if the Warhoons, whose eggs we had destroyed, were a smaller people than his Tharks. I noticed that their eggs were so much smaller than those I saw hatching in your incubator, I added. He explained that the eggs had just been placed there, and like all green Martian eggs, would grow during the 5-year incubation period until they reached the size of those I had seen hatching upon my arrival on Barsoom. This was an interesting revelation, for I had always marveled at how green Martian women, as large as they were, could lay such enormous eggs. In reality, he said, the newly laid eggs were only slightly larger than a goose egg. Growth only commenced when the eggs were exposed to sunlight, making it easy for chieftains to transport hundreds of eggs from the storage vaults to the incubators. Shortly after the incident with the Warhoon eggs, we halted to rest the animals. It was during this stop that the second notable event of the day occurred. I was transferring my riding gear from one of my thoats to the other, as I divided the day's work between them, when Zad approached me. Without a word, he struck my animal a savage blow with his long sword. I needed no manual of green Martian etiquette to know how to respond. Wild with anger, I resisted the urge to draw my pistol and shoot him outright. Instead, I drew my sword to meet him in fair combat. Zad waited, his long sword drawn, giving me no choice but to engage him on equal terms. While I could have chosen a lesser weapon, such as my short sword, dagger, hatchet, or even my fists, I could not use firearms or a spear against him, while he wielded only his long sword. I chose the same weapon as he, because I knew he prided himself on his skill with it. If I defeated him, I wanted to do so on his terms. The fight that ensued was lengthy, delaying the march by an hour. The entire community surrounded us, leaving a clear space of about 100 feet in diameter for our battle. Zad's initial strategy was to rush me down like a bull charging a wolf. However, I was too quick for him. Each time he lunged past me, I sidestepped and delivered a minor cut to his arm or back. Soon, blood streamed from a half-dozen wounds, yet I could not find an opening for a decisive strike. Zad then shifted his tactics. Fighting warily and with remarkable dexterity, he attempted to outmaneuver me with skill where brute strength had failed. I must admit, he was a magnificent swordsman. Had it not been for my superior endurance and the increased agility granted by Mars' lower gravity, I might not have withstood his onslaught. For a time, we circled one another, trading blows without landing a significant hit. The long, needle-like swords flashed in the sunlight and rang out in the still air with every clash. Realizing he was tiring faster than I, Zad decided to end the fight with a final, desperate charge. As he rushed toward me, a blinding flash of light struck my eyes. I could not see his approach and leapt blindly to one side, hoping to evade the blade I already imagined tearing into my vitals. I was only partially successful. A sharp pain in my left shoulder testified to my failure. As I regained my focus, I beheld a scene that would remain etched in my memory forever. On Dejathoris' chariot stood 3 figures, Dejathoris, Sola, and Sarkoia. As my fleeting glance swept over them, a little tableau was presented, which will stand graven in my memory to the day of my death. Dejathoris turned upon Sarkoia with the fury of a young tigress, striking something from her upraised hand, something that flashed in the sunlight as it fell to the ground. In that moment, I understood what had blinded me at the crucial moment of the fight, and how Sarkoia had sought to kill me without delivering the fatal blow herself. But that was not all I saw. Sarkoia, her face livid with hatred and frustration, drew a dagger and aimed a vicious blow at Dejathoris. At the last moment, faithful Sola sprang between them. The final image I glimpsed before returning my attention to Zad was Sarkoia's blade descending towards Sola's shielding breast. My adversary had recovered from his missed thrust and was pressing me fiercely. Though my mind was elsewhere, I forced myself to focus on the fight. Time and again, we clashed until, suddenly, feeling Zad's sword point at my chest in a thrust I could neither parry nor evade, I threw myself forward with my own outstretched sword, determined not to die alone. I drove all my weight into the thrust. I felt his blade tear into my chest as darkness closed in around me. My head spun with dizziness, and my knees buckled beneath me. Chapter 15. Sola tells me her story. When consciousness returned, and as I soon learned, I had been down, but a moment I sprang quickly to my feet, searching for my sword. There it was, buried to the hilt in the green breast of Zad, who lay stone dead upon the ochre moss of the ancient sea bottom. As I regained my senses, I realized his weapon had pierced my left breast, passing through the flesh and muscles covering my ribs. It had entered near the center of my chest and exited below the shoulder. In my lunge, I had turned just enough for his sword to pass beneath the muscles, inflicting a painful but non-lethal wound. Removing the blade from my body, I retrieved my own sword. Turning my back on his ugly carcass, I moved, sick and sore and disgusted, toward the chariots that bore my retinue and belongings. A murmur of Martian applause greeted me, but I cared not for it. Bleeding and weak, I reached my women, who, accustomed to such occurrences, dressed my wounds with the marvelous healing agents of Barsoom. These remedies rendered only the most instantaneous death blows fatal. Give a Martian woman a chance, and death must take a back seat. They soon patched me up, so that aside from some weakness from blood loss and a bit of soreness around the wound, I suffered no great distress. Under earthly treatment, such an injury would likely have left me incapacitated for days. Once they were finished, I hastened to the chariot of Dejathorus. There, I found poor Sola, her chest swathed in bandages, but apparently little the worse for her encounter with Sarkoya. It seemed Sarkoja's dagger had struck the edge of one of Sola's metal breast ornaments, deflecting the blade and causing only a slight flesh wound. As I approached, I saw Dejathorus lying prone upon her silks and furs, her lithe form racked with sobs. She did not notice my presence, nor did she hear me speaking with Sola, who stood a short distance from the vehicle. "Is she injured?" I asked Sola, indicating Dejathorus with a nod. "No," Sola replied. "She thinks you are dead, and that her grandmother's cat may now have no one to polish its teeth?" I queried, smiling. "I think you wrong her, John Carter," Sola said. "I do not understand her ways or yours, but I am sure the granddaughter of 10,000 Jedeks would not grieve like this over the death of one she considered beneath her, or indeed, over anyone who did not hold the highest claim on her affections. They are a proud race, but they are just, as are all Barsoomians. You must have hurt or wronged her grievously, for she will not acknowledge your existence while living, though she mourns you in death. Tears are a rare sight on Barsoom," Sola continued, "and so it is difficult for me to interpret them. I have seen only 2 people weep in all my life, other than Dejathorus. One wept from sorrow, the other from baffled rage. The first was my mother, years ago, before they killed her. The other was Sarkoya, when they dragged her away from me today." "Your mother," I exclaimed. "But, Sola, you could not have known your mother, child." "But I did, and my father also," she added. "If you wish to hear the strange and un-Barsoomian tale, come to the chariot tonight, John Carter, and I will tell you of that which I have never spoken of before. And now the signal has been given to resume the march. You must go." "I will come tonight, Sola," I promised. "Be sure to tell Dejathorus I am alive and well. I shall not force myself upon her, and be certain she does not know I saw her tears. If she wishes to speak with me, I await her command." Sola mounted the chariot, which swung into place in the line, and I hastened to my waiting thoat, galloping to my station beside Tars Tarkas at the rear of the column. We made an imposing and awe-inspiring spectacle as we strung out across the yellow landscape. 250 ornate, brightly colored chariots, preceded by an advance guard of some 200 mounted warriors and chieftains riding 5 abreast, spaced 100 yards apart, and followed by an equal number in the same formation, with a score or more of flankers on either side. 50 extra mastodons, or heavy draft animals known as zitidars, and 600 extra thoats belonging to the warriors ran loose within the hollow square formed by the surrounding riders. The gleaming metal and jewels of the men and women's ornaments, mirrored in the trappings of the zitidars and thoats, interspersed with the vivid colors of silks, furs, and feathers, lent a barbaric splendor to the caravan that would have turned an East Indian potentate green with envy. The enormous, broad tires of the chariots and the padded feet of the animals made no sound on the moss-covered sea bottom. Thus, we moved in utter silence, like some vast phantasmagoria, except when the stillness was broken by the guttural growling of a goaded zitidar or the squealing of fighting thoats. The green Martians spoke little, and when they did, their monosyllabic exchanges resembled the faint rumble of distant thunder. We traversed a trackless waste of moss, which, yielding to the pressure of broad tires or padded feet, rose again behind us, leaving no trace of our passage. We might indeed have been the wraiths of the departed dead upon the dead sea of that dying planet. For all the sound or sign we made in passing, it was the first march of a large body of men and animals I had ever witnessed that raised no dust and left no spoor. There is no dust upon Mars except in the cultivated districts during the winter months, and even then, the absence of high winds renders it almost unnoticeable. We camped that night at the foot of the hills we had been approaching for 2 days, which marked the southern boundary of this particular sea. Our animals had gone 2 days without drink and nearly 2 months without water, not since shortly after leaving Thark. Yet, as Tarkas explained to me, they required little and could live almost indefinitely on the moss that covers Barsoom. This moss, he told me, contains enough moisture within its tiny stems to meet the limited demands of the animals. After partaking of my evening meal of cheese-like food and vegetable milk, I sought out Sola, whom I found working by the light of a torch upon some of Tarkas' trappings. She looked up at my approach, her face lighting with pleasure and welcome. "I am glad you came," she said. "Dejathora sleeps, and I am lonely. My own people care not for me. John Carter, I am too unlike them. It is a sad fate, for I must live my life among them. I often wish I were a true green Martian woman, without love and without hope. But I have known love, and so I am lost. I promise to tell you my story, or rather the story of my parents, from what I have learned of you and the ways of your people. I am sure the tale will not seem strange to you, but among the green Martians, it has no parallel within the memory of the oldest living Thark. Nor do our legends hold many similar tales. My mother was rather small, too small to be entrusted with the responsibilities of maternity, as our chieftains breed primarily for size. She was also less cold and cruel than most green Martian women. Caring little for their society, she often roamed the deserted avenues of Thark alone, or sat among the wildflowers on the nearby hills, lost in thought and wishing for things I believe only I, among Tharkian women today, may understand. Am I not my mother's child? Among the hills, she met a young warrior whose duty was to guard the feeding zitidars and thoats, ensuring they did not stray beyond the hills. At first, they spoke only of simple matters of interest to the Tharks. Gradually, as they met more often, and as it became evident to both that their meetings were no longer by chance, they began to talk of themselves, their likes, their ambitions, and their hopes. She trusted him and confessed her deep repugnance for the cruelties of their kind and the hideous, loveless lives they were destined to lead. She braced herself for the storm of denunciation she expected from his cold, hard lips. But instead, he took her in his arms and kissed her. For 6 long years, they kept their love a secret. My mother belonged to the retinue of the great Talhages, while her lover was a simple warrior, wearing only his own metal. Had their defiance of Tharkian tradition been discovered, both would have been executed in the great arena before Talhages and the assembled hordes. The egg from which I came was hidden beneath a great glass vessel atop the highest and most inaccessible of Thark's partially ruined towers. Once each year, my mother visited it during its 5-year incubation. She dared not come more often, fearing her every move was watched. During this time, my father gained great distinction as a warrior, taking the medal of several chieftains. His love for my mother never wavered, and his one ambition was to rise high enough to challenge Talhages himself. As ruler of the Tharks, he believed he could claim her as his own and protect the child whose life would otherwise be forfeit if their secret was discovered. It was a wild dream to wrest control from Talhages in just 5 years, but his rise was swift. He soon stood high in the councils of Thark. Then, one day, the chance was lost forever, at least in time to save his loved ones. He was ordered on a long expedition to the ice-clad south to wage war on the natives and seize their furs. Such is the way of the Green Martians. They do not labor for what they can take by force. He was gone for 4 years, and by the time he returned, all had been over for 3. A year after his departure, shortly before the return of an expedition sent to fetch the hatchlings from a community incubator, my egg had hatched. Thereafter, my mother kept me in the old tower, visiting nightly and lavishing on me the love that community life would have denied us. She hoped, upon the return of the expedition, to mix me with the other young destined for the quarters of Talhages, thus escaping the punishment that discovery of her sin against the ancient traditions of the Green Martians would surely bring. She taught me rapidly the language and customs of my kind, and one night she told me the story I have just shared with you, impressing upon me the necessity of absolute secrecy and the great caution I must exercise. After she placed me with the other young Tharks, I was to permit no one to guess that I was further advanced in education than they, nor by any sign to divulge, in the presence of others, my affection for her or my knowledge of my parentage. Then, drawing me close, she whispered in my ear the name of my father. At that moment, a light suddenly flashed into the darkness of the tower chamber, and there stood Sarkoya, her baleful eyes gleaming with loathing and contempt as she glared at my mother. The torrent of hatred and abuse she poured forth turned my young heart cold with terror. It was clear she had overheard the entire story. Her presence there, on that fateful night, was the result of her suspicions about my mother's frequent, long, nightly absences from her quarters. One thing, however, Sarkoya had not learned: the whispered name of my father. This was evident from her repeated demands for my mother to disclose the identity of her partner in sin. But no amount of abuse or threats could compel her to reveal it. To protect me from torture, my mother lied, claiming that she alone knew the name and that she would never tell, not even to her child. With a final stream of curses, Sarkoya hurried away to report her discovery to Talhages. In the meantime, my mother, wrapping me in the silks and furs of her night coverings so that I was scarcely noticeable, descended to the streets. She ran wildly toward the outskirts of the city, heading south toward the man whose protection she could not claim, but whose face she longed to see one last time before her death. As we neared the city's southern edge, we heard sounds from the mossy flat beyond, the squealing of thoats, the grumbling of zitadars, and the clank of arms, announcing the approach of a group of warriors. My mother thought it might be my father returning from his expedition, yet, cautious and wary, she did not run to meet him. Instead, she retreated into the shadows of a doorway, waiting for the cavalcade to appear. Soon, the procession entered the avenue, breaking formation and spreading out across the thoroughfare. As the led chariots passed, the lesser moon rose above the rooftops, illuminating the scene with its wondrous light. My mother shrank deeper into the shadows, realizing it was not my father's expedition, but the returning caravan bearing the young Tharks. Instantly, her plan was formed. As a great chariot passed close to our hiding place, she slipped onto the trailing tailboard, crouching low in the shadow of the high sides and clutching me tightly to her bosom in a frenzy of love. She knew, as I did not, that this would be the last time she held me to her breast or gazed upon my face. In the confusion of the plaza, she mingled me with the other children, whose guardians were now free to relinquish their responsibilities. We were herded into a large room, fed by women who had remained behind, and the next day we were distributed among the retinues of the chieftains. I never saw my mother again. She was imprisoned by Talhages, who subjected her to every imaginable horror and shame in an attempt to extract the name of my father. Despite the torture, she remained steadfast and loyal. She died at last amidst the laughter of Talhages and his chieftains during one of her ordeals. I later learned that she claimed to have killed me to spare me from a similar fate, saying she had thrown my body to the white apes. Sarkoya alone disbelieved her. To this day, I am certain she suspects my true origin, though she does not dare expose me. I believe she also guesses the identity of my father, though she remains silent for now. When my father returned from his expedition and learned of my mother's fate, I was present as Talhages relayed the tale. My father betrayed no emotion, not even the faintest twitch of a muscle. Only he did not laugh as Talhages gleefully described my mother's death struggles. From that moment, he became the cruelest of the cruel. I await the day when he will achieve his ambition and stand over the carcass of Talhages. I am certain he harbors a terrible vengeance in his heart, and that his great love for my mother burns as strongly now as it did nearly 40 years ago. And your father, Sola, is he with us now? I asked. Yes, she replied, but he does not know me for what I am, nor does he know who betrayed my mother to Talhages. I alone know my father's name. Only I, Talhages, and Sarkoya know that it was she who carried the tale that brought death and torture to the woman he loved. We sat in silence for a few moments. She, lost in the gloomy thoughts of her terrible past, and I, in pity for the poor creatures doomed by their heartless customs to lives of cruelty and hate. At last, she spoke again. John Carter, if ever a real man walked the dead bosom of Barsoom, it is you. I trust you. And because I trust you, I will tell you the name of my father. Perhaps this knowledge may someday help you, him, Dejathorus, or myself. I place no conditions upon your tongue. When the time comes, speak the truth if it seems right to you. I trust you because I know you are not cursed with the terrible trait of absolute and unswerving truthfulness, that you could lie like one of your own Virginia gentlemen if a lie would save others from sorrow or suffering. My father's name is Tarkas. Chapter 16. We plan escape. The remainder of our journey to Thark was uneventful. We were 20 days on the road, crossing 2 sea bottoms and passing through or around several ruined cities, most of them smaller than Corid. Twice, we crossed the famous Martian waterways, or canals, as they are called by our earthly astronomers. When we approached these points, a warrior would be sent far ahead with a powerful field glass. If no large body of red Martian troops was in sight, we would advance as close as possible without risking detection and then camp until nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, we would slowly approach the cultivated tract, locate one of the numerous broad highways that cross these areas at regular intervals, and creep silently and stealthily across to the arid lands on the other side. Each crossing required several hours of cautious travel. One crossing took 5 hours without a single halt, while the other consumed the entire night, so that we were just leaving the confines of the high-walled fields as the sun broke over the horizon. Crossing in the darkness, I could see very little, except for fleeting glimpses of the landscape illuminated by the nearer moon as it hurtled wildly through the Barsoomian heavens. Occasionally, I saw walled fields, low rambling buildings resembling earthly farms, and methodically arranged trees, some of which were of enormous height. Within the enclosures, animals announced their presence with terrified squeals and snorts as they scented our wild beasts and wilder human figures. Only once did I see a human being during these crossings. It happened at the intersection of our crossroad with the wide, white turnpike that cuts through each cultivated district at its center. The figure must have been sleeping beside the road, for as our caravan approached, he raised himself on one elbow. After a single glance at the advancing Tharks, he leaped to his feet with a shriek, fleeing madly down the road and scaling a nearby wall with the agility of a frightened cat. The Tharks paid him no heed, as they were not on the warpath. The only sign that they had noticed him was the quickening pace of the caravan as we hastened toward the desert that marked our entry into the realm of Tall Hages. Not once during this time did I have any interaction with Dejathoris. She sent no word to me indicating I would be welcome at her chariot, and my foolish pride kept me from making any advances. I truly believe that a man's way with women is inversely proportional to his prowess among men. The weakling and the fool often excel in charming the fair sex, while the fighting man, who can face 1,000 dangers without fear, cowers like a frightened child in the face of a woman's scorn. 30 days after my arrival on Barsoom, we entered the ancient city of Thark, named by the green men who had stolen even its name from its long-forgotten inhabitants. The hordes of Thark number some 30,000 souls, divided into 25 communities. Each community has its own Jed and lesser chieftains, but all are under the rule of Tall Hages, Jeddak of Thark. 5 communities are headquartered in the city of Thark, while the others occupy deserted cities throughout the region claimed by Tall Hages. We entered the great central plaza early in the afternoon. There were no enthusiastic or friendly greetings for the returning expedition. Those who happened to be in sight merely called out the names of warriors or women they recognized in formal greetings. However, when it was discovered that we had brought 2 captives, a greater interest was aroused. Dejathoris and I became the centers of attention for inquisitive groups. We were soon assigned new quarters, and the remainder of the day was spent settling into our new accommodations. My home was located at the far end of an avenue leading into the plaza from the south, the main thoroughfare through which we had marched into the city. My quarters, at the end of the square, consisted of an entire building to myself. The grandeur of architecture, so prominent in Korid, was even more remarkable here, featuring larger and richer designs. My new home would have been suitable for the greatest earthly emperors. Yet to the Tharks, only the size and enormity of the chambers held appeal. Tall Hages, for instance, occupied an enormous public building, likely the largest in the city, entirely unsuited for residential purposes. Other Jeds and chieftains occupied similarly outsized buildings along the plaza, while the lesser warriors either resided with their leaders or found shelter in the many unoccupied structures scattered throughout the city. By the time my quarters were in order, or rather, I had ensured they were put in order, it was nearing sunset. I decided to search for Sola and her charges, intending to speak with Dejathoris and impress upon her the necessity of establishing a truce, at least until I could devise a plan to aid her escape. I searched in vain until the sun dipped below the horizon. Just as the last rays of light disappeared, I caught sight of Wola's unmistakable head peering from a second-story window in a building across the street from my quarters, near the plaza. Without hesitation, I bolted up the winding runway to the second floor. Entering a grand chamber at the front of the building, I was greeted by Woola, who threw himself upon me with such enthusiasm that he nearly knocked me to the floor. The poor creature was so overjoyed to see me that it seemed he might devour me, his massive head splitting into a grotesque grin that revealed his 3 rows of tusks in a hobgoblin smile. Quieting Woola with a word of command and a caress, I looked hurriedly through the approaching gloom for a sign of Dejathoris. Not seeing her, I called her name. There was an answering murmur from the far corner of the apartment. With a couple of quick strides, I was beside her, where she crouched among the furs and silks upon an ancient carved wooden seat. As I waited, she rose to her full height, and looking me straight in the eye, she said, "What would Doter Sojat Thark of Dejathoris, his captive?" Dejathoris, I do not know how I have angered you. It was farthest from my desire to hurt or offend you, whom I had hoped to protect and comfort. Have none of me if it is your will, but you must aid me in effecting your escape if such a thing is possible. This is not my request, but my command. When you are safe once more at your father's court, you may do with me as you please. But until that day, I am your master, and you must obey and aid me." She looked at me long and earnestly, and I thought she was softening toward me. "I understand your words, Doter Sojat," she replied. "But you, I do not understand. You are a queer mixture of child and man, of brute and noble. I only wish that I might read your heart. Look down at your feet, Dejathoris. It lies there now where it has lain since that other night at Corid, and where it will ever lie, beating alone for you until death stills it forever." She took a small step toward me, her beautiful hands outstretched in a strange, groping gesture. "What do you mean, John Carter?" she whispered. "What are you saying to me?" "I am saying what I had promised myself. I would not say to you, at least not while you remain a captive among the green men. What, from your attitude toward me over the past 20 days, I had thought never to say to you. I am saying, Dejathoris, that I am yours body and soul, to serve you, to fight for you, to die for you. Only one thing I ask in return, that you make no sign, either of condemnation or approval, of my words until you are safe among your own people, and that whatever sentiments you harbor toward me, they not be influenced or colored by gratitude. Whatever I do to serve you will be prompted solely by selfish motives, for it gives me more pleasure to serve you than not. I will respect your wishes, John Carter, because I understand the motives which prompt them. I accept your service no more willingly than I bow to your authority. Your word shall be my law. I have twice wronged you in my thoughts, and again I ask your forgiveness." Further conversation of a personal nature was prevented by the entrance of Sola, who was unusually agitated, wholly unlike her usual calm and composed self. "That horrible Sarkoia has been before Tall Hages," she cried. "And from what I heard in the plaza, there is little hope for either of you." "What do they say?" inquired Dejathoris. "They say you will be thrown to the wild Kalats, dogs, in the great arena as soon as the hordes assemble for the yearly games." "Sola," I said, "you're a Thark, but you hate and loathe the customs of your people as much as we do. Will you not accompany us in one supreme effort to escape? I am sure that Dejathoris can offer you a home and protection among her people, and your fate can be no worse among them than it must ever be here." "Yes," cried Dejathoris. "Come with us, Sola. You will be better off among the red men of Helium than here. I can promise you not only a home with us, but the love and affection your nature craves, which must always be denied you by the customs of your own race. Come with us, Sola. We might go without you, but your fate would be terrible if they thought you had connived to aid us. Even that fear would not tempt you to interfere in our escape. But we want you with us. We want to take you to a land of sunshine and happiness, among people who know the meaning of love, sympathy, and gratitude. Say you will, Sola. Tell me you will. The great waterway which leads to Helium is but 50 miles to the south, murmured Sola, half to herself. A swift boat might make it in 3 hours. And then to Helium it is 500 miles, most of the way through thinly settled districts. They would know, and they would follow us. We might hide among the great trees for a time, but the chances of escape are small indeed. They would follow us to the very gates of Helium, taking toll of life at every step. You do not know them. Is there no other way we might reach Helium? I asked. Can you not draw me a rough map of the country we must traverse, Degathoris? Yes, she replied, taking a great diamond from her hair. She drew upon the marble floor the first map of Barsoomian territory I had ever seen. It was crisscrossed in every direction with long straight lines, sometimes running parallel and sometimes converging toward some great circle. The lines, she explained, were waterways, the circles, cities. One far to the northwest of us, she identified as Helium. There were other cities closer, but she said she feared to enter many of them, as not all were friendly to Helium. Finally, after studying the map carefully in the moonlight that now flooded the room, I pointed to a waterway far to the north of us that also seemed to lead to Helium. Does this not pierce your grandfather's territory? I asked. Yes, she answered. But it is 200 miles north of us. It is one of the waterways we crossed on the trip to Thark. They would never suspect that we would try for that distant waterway, I replied. And that is why I think it is the best route for our escape. Sola agreed with me, and it was decided that we would leave Thark that very night, just as quickly as I could find and saddle my thoats. Sola would ride one, and Degathoris and I would share the other, each carrying sufficient food and drink to last us for 2 days. The animals could not be pushed too hard for such a long journey. I directed Sola to proceed with Degathoris along one of the less frequented avenues to the southern boundary of the city, where I would meet them with the thoats as quickly as possible, leaving them to gather food, silks, and furs for our journey. I slipped quietly to the rear of the first floor and entered the courtyard, where the animals were moving restlessly, as was their habit before settling down for the night. In the shadows of the buildings and under the twin radiance of the Martian moons, the great herd of thoats and zitidars moved about, their low grunts and squeals echoing faintly. The thoats, naturally irritable creatures, were quieter now due to the absence of human presence. But as they scented me, they became more restless, and the noise increased. It was risky business. Entering the paddock of thoats alone at night, the noise might alert nearby warriors, and there was always the danger that a bull thoat might charge without provocation. To minimize the risk, I kept close to the shadows, prepared to leap into a doorway or window at the first sign of danger. Slowly, I made my way to the large gates at the back of the court. As I approached, I called softly to my 2 animals, thanking the providence that had led me to gain their trust and affection. Moments later, I saw their massive forms making their way toward me through the herd. The animals rubbed their muzzles against me, searching for the bits of food I often gave them. Opening the gates, I let them pass through, then slipped out and closed the gates behind me, not wanting to risk saddling or mounting them so close to the city. I led them silently along the shadows of the buildings toward an unfrequented avenue that led to the meeting point. Like disembodied spirits, we moved through the empty streets. It wasn't until we were near the plain beyond the city that I began to breathe more easily. I was confident that Sola and Degathoris would reach the rendezvous point undetected. but I wasn't so sure about myself, as it was unusual for anyone to leave the city after dark. I reached the meeting point safely, but neither Sola nor Degethoris was there. Assuming they had been delayed by some minor complication, I waited patiently. However, after an hour had passed without any sign of them, I began to grow anxious. Another half hour passed, and I was filled with grave concern. Suddenly, the stillness of the night was broken by the sound of an approaching group. From the noise, it was clear this was no group of fugitives stealthily seeking liberty. I watched from the shadows as a score of mounted warriors passed by, dropping just enough words to send my heart racing. He would likely have arranged to meet them just outside the city, and so the rest of the conversation faded as they moved on. But it was enough. Our plan had been discovered. From that moment, I knew our chances of escape were slim. I decided my only course of action was to return undetected to Degethoris's quarters to learn what had happened. However, with the city now likely alert to my escape and 2 large thoats in tow, the task seemed nearly impossible. Then an idea struck me. Relying on my knowledge of the city's architecture, where each square of buildings surrounded an open courtyard, I groped my way through the dark chambers, leading the animals. Though they struggled with some doorways, their massive size proved manageable, and eventually we reached the inner court. The court was covered in moss-like vegetation, which would provide the thoats with food and drink until I could return them to their enclosure. Confident they would remain quiet and content, I removed their saddles and hid them just inside the rear doorway. Turning the animals loose, I made my way across the court to the far side and exited into the avenue beyond, crossing street after street and moving from court to court with minimal risk of detection. I finally reached the courtyard behind Degethoris's quarters. Here, I encountered the beasts belonging to the warriors who resided in the adjacent buildings. Knowing I might encounter warriors within, I opted for a safer method to reach Degethoris. Identifying the building she likely occupied, I used my strength and agility to leap to the sill of a second-story window. Drawing myself inside, I moved stealthily toward the front of the building. As I neared the doorway to her room, I heard voices and froze. Listening closely, I recognized the guttural tones of men and realized the danger. The speaker, a chieftain, was giving orders to 4 of his warriors. And when he returns to this chamber, he said, as he surely will when he finds she does not meet him at the city's edge, you 4 are to spring upon him and disarm him. It will take all your strength to subdue him if the reports from court are true. Once bound, bring him to the vaults beneath the Jedic's quarters and chain him securely until Tall Hages calls for him. Allow no one to speak with him, nor permit anyone to enter this apartment before he comes. As for the girl, by now she is in the hands of Tall Hages. May her ancestors have pity on her, for he will not. Sarkoia has done well this night. I leave you now, but if you fail, I commend your carcasses to the cold bosom of Is. Chapter 17. A Costly Recapture. As the speaker ceased, he turned to leave the apartment by the door where I was standing, but I needed to wait no longer. I had heard enough to fill my soul with dread, and stealing quietly away, I returned to the courtyard by the way I had come. My plan of action was formed in an instant, and crossing the square and bordering avenue on the opposite side, I soon stood within the courtyard of Tall Hages. The brilliantly lit apartments on the first floor told me where to seek first. Advancing to the windows, I peered inside. I quickly discovered that my approach would not be as easy as I had hoped, for the rear rooms bordering the courtyard were filled with warriors and women. I glanced upward at the stories above, noticing that the 3rd floor was apparently unlit. I decided to make my entrance to the building from that point. It was the work of but a moment to reach the windows above, and soon I had drawn myself within the sheltering shadows of the unlit 3rd floor. Fortunately, the room I had entered was unoccupied. Creeping noiselessly into the corridor beyond, I saw light coming from the apartments ahead of me. Reaching what appeared to be a doorway, I discovered that it was merely an opening to an immense inner chamber that towered from the first floor, 2 stories below me, to the dome-like roof high above. The floor of this vast circular hall was thronged with chieftains, warriors, and women. At one end of the room, a great raised platform held the most hideous beast I had ever seen. He bore all the cruel and terrible features of the Green Warriors, accentuated and debased by years of indulgence in his basest instincts. There was no mark of dignity or pride on his grotesque face. His enormous bulk spread itself upon the platform, where he squatted like a monstrous devilfish, his 6 limbs emphasizing the similarity in a ghastly and startling manner. But the sight that froze me with apprehension was Dejathoris and Sola standing before him. The fiendish leer on his face, as his great protruding eyes gorged upon her form, filled me with rage. She was speaking, but I could not hear her words, nor could I make out his low, grumbling reply. She stood erect before him, her head held high, and even from my distant vantage, I could see the scorn and disgust on her face. She let her haughty gaze rest on him without a trace of fear. She was indeed the proud daughter of 1,000 Jedicks, every inch of her dear, precious little frame radiating nobility, though she was so tiny and frail beside the towering warriors around her. Her majesty diminished them into insignificance. I believe even they felt it. Presently, Tall Haegis made a sign for the chamber to be cleared, leaving the prisoners alone before him. Slowly, the chieftains, warriors, and women faded into the shadows of the surrounding chambers. Dejathoris and Sola stood alone before the Jeddak of the Tharks. One chieftain hesitated before departing. I saw him standing in the shadow of a mighty column, his fingers nervously toying with the hilt of his great sword, his cruel eyes bent in implacable hatred upon Tall Haegis. It was Tars Tarkas, and the undisguised loathing on his face revealed his thoughts as if they were an open book. He was thinking of that other woman who, 40 years ago, had stood before this same beast. Had he been able to act in that moment, the reign of Tall Haegis would have ended. But finally, he too strode from the room, not knowing he was leaving his own daughter at the mercy of the creature he most loathed. Tall Haegis arose, and half fearing, half expecting his intentions, I hurried to the winding runway leading to the floors below. No one intercepted me, and I reached the main floor of the chamber unnoticed, taking my place in the shadow of the same column Tars Tarkas had recently abandoned. I watched as Tall Haegis began to speak. Princess of Helium, I might wring a mighty ransom from your people were I to return you unharmed, but 1,000 times rather would I watch your beautiful face writhe in the agony of torture. It shall be long and drawn out, I promise you. 10 days of pleasure would be far too short to show the love I bear for your race. The terrors of your death shall haunt the red men for all eternity. Fathers will shudder as they tell their children of the awful vengeance of the green men, of the power, might, and cruelty of Tall Haegis. But before the torture begins, you shall be mine for 1 short hour. News of it shall reach Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium, your grandfather, that he may writhe in the agony of his soul. Tomorrow the torture will commence. Tonight thou art Tall Haegis. Come. He sprang down from the platform and roughly grasped her arm. Scarcely had he touched her when I leaped between them. My short sword, sharp and gleaming, was in my hand. I could have plunged it into his putrid heart before he realized I was there. But as I raised my arm to strike, I thought of Tars Tarkas. Even in my rage and hatred, I could not rob him of the moment he had awaited for so long. Instead, I swung my fist full upon Tall Haegis's jaw. Without a sound, he crumpled to the floor as though dead. In the same silence, I grasped Degethoris by the hand and motioned for Sola to follow. We sped noiselessly from the chamber to the floor above. Unseen, we reached a rear window. Using straps and leather from my trappings, I lowered Sola and then Degethoris to the ground below, dropping lightly after them. I quickly led them through the shadows of the buildings and back over the course I had recently taken from the city's outskirts. We reached my thoats in the courtyard where I had left them. Placing the trappings upon the animals, we hastened through the building to the avenue beyond. Sola mounted one beast, while Degethoris and I shared the other. Together, we rode from the city of Thark through the hills to the south. Instead of circling back toward the nearest waterway, we struck northeast across the mossy waste. For 200 dangerous miles lay another artery leading to Helium. No words were spoken as we left the city far behind, but I could hear the quiet sobbing of Degethoris as she clung to me, her dear head resting against my shoulder. "If we make it, my chieftain, the debt of Helium to you will be a mighty one," she said softly. "And should we not make it, the debt is no less, though Helium will never know. For you have saved the last of our line from a fate worse than death." I did not answer, but reached to my side and pressed the little fingers of her hand as they clung to me. In the unbroken silence, we sped over the yellow, moonlit moss. Each of us was lost in thought. For my part, I could not help but feel joy, despite the dangers that lay ahead. With Degethoris close to me, my heart sang as though we were already entering the gates of Helium. Our earlier plans had been so sadly upset that we now found ourselves without food or drink, and I alone was armed. We therefore urged our beasts to a speed that would surely exhaust them long before we could hope to sight the end of the first stage of our journey. We rode all night and through the following day, taking only a few short rests. By the second night, both we and our animals were completely fagged. We lay down upon the moss and slept for 5 or 6 hours before resuming the journey just before dawn. The entire following day we pressed forward, but late in the afternoon, when we had yet to see any trees marking the great waterways of Barsoom, a terrible truth struck us. We were lost. Evidently, we had circled, but which way it was difficult to say. Nor did it seem possible with the sun to guide us by day, and the moons and stars by night was a mystery. At any rate, no waterway was in sight, and we were all nearly spent from hunger, thirst, and fatigue. Far ahead of us, slightly to the right, we could make out the outline of low mountains. We decided to head toward them in the hope that a ridge might reveal the missing waterway. Night fell before we reached our goal. Faint from weariness and weakness, we lay down to sleep. I was awakened early the next morning by the weight of some large body pressing close to mine. Opening my eyes, I saw my faithful old Woola snuggling close to me. The loyal creature had followed us across the trackless waste to share our fate, whatever it might be. Wrapping my arms around his neck, I pressed my cheek against his. I am not ashamed of the tears that came to my eyes as I thought of his unwavering devotion. Shortly after this, Degethoris and Sola awakened, and we decided to push on at once toward the hills. We had traveled scarcely a mile when I noticed my thoat beginning to stumble and stagger pitifully, even though we had not urged them beyond a walk since noon the previous day. Suddenly, it lurched wildly to one side and collapsed. Degethoris and I were thrown clear and landed on the soft moss with little harm. But the poor beast was in a pitiful condition. It could not even rise, despite being relieved of our weight. Sola assured me that the coolness of the approaching night, combined with rest, might revive the animal, and so we decided not to kill it, as had been my first intention. Leaving its trappings beside it, we moved on with our remaining thoat. Sola and I walked while Degethoris rode, though she protested vehemently. We had nearly reached the base of the hills, about a mile away, when Dejathoris, from her elevated position, cried out that she saw a large party of mounted men descending a pass in the hills several miles away. Sola and I looked where she pointed and saw several hundred mounted warriors moving in a southwesterly direction, away from us. They were likely Thark warriors sent to capture us, and we sighed in relief at their retreat. Quickly lifting Dejathoris from the thoat, I commanded the animal to lie down. The three of us followed suit, trying to make ourselves as inconspicuous as possible to avoid detection. We watched as the warriors filed out of the pass, disappearing behind a ridge. It seemed providential, for if they had remained visible longer, they would surely have seen us. However, as the last warrior emerged, he halted and raised a small but powerful field glass to his eye, scanning the sea bottom in all directions. Clearly, he was a chieftain, as he brought up the rear of the column, a typical formation among the green men. As his glass swept toward us, our hearts stopped. The glass paused. The tension was unbearable as he held us in view. Then he lowered it and shouted a command to the warriors who had disappeared behind the ridge. Instead of waiting for them to join him, he wheeled his thoat and charged toward us. There was only one option, and I had to act quickly. Raising my strange Martian rifle, I sighted carefully and pressed the trigger. The missile struck its mark, and the chieftain pitched backward off his mount. Springing to my feet, I urged the thoat to rise and directed Sola to take Dejathoris and ride toward the hills, hoping they might find temporary refuge in the ravines and gullies. Forcing my revolvers into their hands as a last means of protection or escape, I lifted Dejathoris onto the thoat behind Sola. "Goodbye, my princess," I whispered. "We may meet in Helium yet. I've escaped worse plights than this," I added with a forced smile. "What?" she cried. "Are you not coming with us?" "How can I, Dejathoris? Someone must hold them off, and I can do so better alone." She leapt from the thoat, throwing her arms around my neck. "Fly, Sola," she said with quiet dignity. "Dejathoris remains to die with the man she loves." Those words etched themselves onto my heart. Gladly would I have died 1,000 deaths to hear them again, but there was no time. Pressing my lips to hers for the first time, I lifted her and placed her firmly behind Sola once more, commanding Sola to hold her by force if necessary. I slapped the thoat's flank and watched them ride away, Dejathoris struggling to free herself. Turning back, I saw the green warriors cresting the ridge. In a moment, they spotted me, lying flat on the moss. I fired at them until my rifle's magazine was empty. By the time I discarded the weapon, Dejathoris and Sola had disappeared among the hills. I sprang up and raced in the opposite direction, hoping to lead the warriors away from them. The green men gave chase, but when my foot struck a jagged piece of quartz, I fell sprawling to the ground. In moments, they were upon me. I drew my long sword to sell my life dearly, but their blows overwhelmed me. My head swam, darkness enveloped me, and I fell into oblivion. Chapter 18. Chained in Warhoon. It must have been several hours before I regained consciousness, and I well remember the feeling of surprise that swept over me as I realized I was not dead. I was lying among a pile of sleeping silks and furs in the corner of a small room occupied by several green warriors. Bending over me was an ancient and ugly female. As I opened my eyes, she turned to one of the warriors and said, "He will live, O Jed." "'Tis well," replied the one so addressed, rising and approaching my couch. "He should render rare sport for the great games." Now, as my eyes fell upon him, I saw that he was no Thark, for his ornaments and metal were not of that horde. He was a massive figure, terribly scarred about the face and chest, with one broken tusk and a missing ear. Strapped across his chest were human skulls, and hanging from them were dried human hands. His reference to the great games, of which I had heard so much while among the Tharks, convinced me that I had only leaped from purgatory into Gehenna. After exchanging a few more words with the female, during which she assured him I was fully fit to travel, the jet ordered that we mount and ride after the main column. I was strapped securely to as wild and unmanageable a thoat as I had ever seen, with a mounted warrior on either side to keep the beast from bolting. We rode forth at a furious pace in pursuit of the column. My wounds gave me little pain. So wonderfully and rapidly had the applications and injections of the female worked their therapeutic magic, and so deftly had she bound and treated my injuries. Just before dark, we reached the main body of troops, shortly after they had made camp for the night. I was immediately taken before their leader, who proved to be the Jeddak of the Warhoon hordes. Like the Jed who had captured me, he was frightfully scarred and adorned with a breastplate of human skulls and dried hands, which marked the greater warriors among the Warhoons and attested to their savage ferocity, a savagery that far exceeded even that of the Tharks. The Jeddak Barcomas, who was comparatively young, was the object of fierce and jealous hatred from his old lieutenant, Dak Kova, the Jed who had captured me. I could not help but notice Dak Kova's calculated efforts to insult his superior. He omitted the formal salute as we entered the Jeddak's presence, and, pushing me roughly forward, exclaimed in a loud and menacing voice, "I have brought a strange creature wearing the metal of a Thark. It is my pleasure to see him battle a wild thoat at the great games. He will die as Barcomas, your Jeddak, sees fit, if at all," replied the young ruler with emphasis and dignity. "If at all?" roared Dak Kova. "By the dead hands at my throat, he shall die, Barcomas. No weakness on your part shall save him. Oh, would that Warhoon were ruled by a real Jeddak, rather than by a weakling from whom even Dak Kova could wrest the metal with his bare hands." Barcomas eyed the defiant chieftain with fearless contempt. Without a word, he hurled himself at Dak Kova's throat. I had never seen two green Martian warriors battle without weapons. The exhibition of sheer animal ferocity was as horrifying as anything the most disordered imagination could conceive. They tore at each other's eyes and ears with their hands, slashing and goring with their tusks until both were reduced to bloody, mutilated forms. Barcomas had the advantage, being stronger, quicker, and more intelligent. The battle seemed near its end, needing only the final death thrust, when Barcomas slipped in, breaking from a clinch. Dak Kova seized the opportunity, driving his tusk into Barcomas' groin and ripping him open with a final effort. The young Jeddak collapsed, lifeless, his body a mass of blood and torn flesh. Barcomas was dead. Only the Herculean efforts of Dak Kova's attendants saved him from the same fate. 3 days later, Dak Kova walked unassisted to the body of Barcomas. Placing his foot on the fallen ruler's neck, he claimed the title of Jeddak of Warhoon. The dead Jeddak's head and hands were removed to adorn Dak Kova's regalia, and the remains were cremated amid wild laughter. The injuries to Dak Kova had delayed the march so greatly that it was decided to postpone the expedition, which was a raid upon a small Thark community in retaliation for the destruction of the incubator, until after the Great Games. The entire body of warriors, 10,000 in number, turned back toward Warhoon. My introduction to these cruel and bloodthirsty people was only an index to the horrors I witnessed almost daily while with them. They are a smaller horde than the Tharks, but much more ferocious. Not a day passed without some members of the various Warhoon communities engaging in deadly combat. I witnessed as many as 8 mortal duels in a single day. We reached the city of Warhoon after 3 days' march, and I was immediately cast into a dungeon, heavily chained to the floor and walls. Food was brought to me at intervals, but owing to the utter darkness of the place, I could not tell whether I lay there for days, weeks, or months. it was the most horrible experience of my life, and that my mind did not succumb to the terrors of that inky blackness has been a wonder to me ever since. The place was filled with creeping, crawling things. A cold, sinuous bodies slithered over me as I lay down. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of gleaming, fiery eyes fixed in horrifying intent upon me. No sound reached me from the world above, and no word would my jailer speak when he brought my food, despite my bombardment of questions. Finally, all my hatred and maniacal loathing for these awful creatures who had imprisoned me was focused on this single emissary, who, in my fraying mind, came to represent the entire horde of warhoons. I noticed that he always advanced with his dim torch to a point where he could place the food within my reach. As he stooped to deposit it on the floor, his head was level with my chest. With the cunning of a madman, I backed into the far corner of my cell when I heard his approach. Gathering a slack length of the heavy chain that bound me, I crouched like a beast of prey. As he stooped to place my food, I swung the chain with all my strength, crashing the links onto his skull. Without a sound, he slipped to the floor, stone dead. Laughing and chattering like the idiot I was fast becoming, I fell upon his prostrate form, my fingers searching for his throat. Presently, I felt a small chain with a set of keys dangling from it. The touch of those keys brought back my sanity in an instant. No longer was I a gibbering idiot, but a sane, reasoning man with a means of escape within my grasp. As I groped to remove the chain from my victim's neck, I glanced into the darkness and saw 6 pairs of gleaming eyes fixed unwaveringly upon me. Slowly, they advanced as I shrank back in horror, retreating into the corner of my cell. With palms outstretched, I tried to ward off the dreadful eyes as they crept toward the dead body at my feet. Then, as silently as they had come, the eyes retreated. This time, however, they left behind a strange grating sound, which echoed ominously until it faded into the distant recesses of my dungeon.
Thank you so much for joining me today and listening to the story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. If you liked today's tale, give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. I can't wait to see you next time for another magical adventure. Until then, take care and keep imagining.